You can give us an insight into the architectural side of the process and where people begin, because we find people come to us and they have no experience whatsoever. They have no idea where to start. They don't know the benefits of using an architect. They don't know what they need to turn up with as far as a brief goes. So I'll sort of hand it over to you and you can sort of try and tell us from the beginning.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Trevor. So I think that building a new house is quite a unique experience for a lot of clients, particularly when they haven't done it before.
Yeah.
So I think having a client that's experienced and has built a house before is quite different to a client that hasn't approached the building process before at all. So I guess from our side is understanding what their level of experience with building is in the first place. Obviously, if it's a new client which hasn't had that experience before, then we like to take a very gentle approach and sort of help start to explain that building process in detail. Some of the key fundamentals from the outset, though, is making sure we understand what their brief is. So we spend quite a bit of time understanding what sort of type of house they're after, and assist. And some people don't necessarily know exactly what that is, so we can assist them during that process in actually establishing what their brief is at the outset, how many living rooms they actually do require, number of bathrooms. So that's sort of the spatial aspect. The other part that's also really important is that we understand what the site is. Some clients might not even necessarily have a site, so we can help with site selection. Other clients will have a site, and we can visit the site, understand the general topography of the site, any sort of where is the sun coming from, where is the wind coming from, any particular vistas that they want to capture, or any vistas that we're interested in we think we can explore within the building and the layout of it. There may be any privacy concerns, and then there's a whole range of different compliance aspects around the actual planning of the site in terms of building consent and resource consent process. So as far as the resource consent, there might be various height planes, daylight angles, there may be some geotechnical issues with the site or some covenants on the site that we need to meet too, so we'd work through all those very early on so that we understand what the site constraints themselves are. From there, we would then look to do essentially a bit of what we call pre-design work. So we'd look at some bulk and location studies for the building. We'd look at some site massing and how the different options for the site and what the spatial requirements for the clients are.
Yeah.
We'd start to lay those out. And that might be a point where we actually then start to have another discussion with the client around what the various options are for the site, around the limitations and what we can actually lay the site out to be. And then it's very much sort of from our point of view, it's often very just gentle steps along the way so that we don't get too far down a route before the client decides that's not particularly what they're after. So we like to lead them down the design process in quite an intimate sort of process that people actually feel like they're contributing and that they actually get some input and they're actually getting the information at the right time in order to make a informed decision about the process.
So at that first stage, do you do a few sketches to give people some ideas to start on how it's going to the design could possibly work for their site?
Yep, often it's done with sketches, or we might even do a very bulk and location model on the computer. We tend to look at a variety of different media options depending on what suits the client and how sort of complex the site is. For more straightforward sites, some simple sketches are quite appropriate. For sites with quite a few constraints, then we might work something up in the computer so we've got some more accurate modelling around the topography and the daylight, so that we can work those together. So it's a bit of a combination of media at that particular point.
Yeah.
Sometimes even a physical model might be appropriate too, depending on if the client's having difficulty visualising the site or some of the massing that we're proposing as well.
And even at this early stage, what you've just said to this point, there's a lot of things that need to be considered that obviously people need somebody who knows what they're doing to cover all those things off, because that's the importance of someone like yourself who has that experience and that ability to deliver that as a start point for people.
That's right. Essentially, it's the key. The decisions that are made at the start of the project are the key decisions, and they're the ones that actually ultimately end up informing the project and whether or not it's going to be a successful project or not. If you don't have the briefing right, you don't have the bulk and location right, then either the client's not going to be happy in terms of what they actually get as an outcome, both in terms of spatially what they required and also whether or not the building actually performs in terms of capturing the right vistas or the actual thermal performance of the building as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Probably the other key aspect too at an early stage is if it's an option, is often having a discussion around procurement and around builders, and obviously any opportunity we've got to get the builder involved early can also bring an extra pair of skills to the table as well. So the site may have some quite specific constraints potentially around construction, and if that's the case, then having a builder on board early can actually help with the collaborative approach that we'd usually look at, and starting to inform different bulk and location, different orientation, different setups that might lead to more economic or more desired outcomes in terms of structural solutions and constructability of the building too. So,
especially if you're dealing with a company that sort of practice in that field and they're used to the complications that arise from particular sites, and it does obviously lend itself to a really good collaboration, and both parties will obviously benefit.
That's right, and I think the more complex and the more tricky the site is, or the more aspirational the building is, then the more important that becomes too. At the same time. So probably the next part of that particular part of the process is, once we've got the bulk and location and the briefing agreed with the client and everybody's happy, then we would proceed with the concept design, and that's when we're sort of looking at, and that's where probably the second part of the briefing can also take place. So we're starting to think about the look and the feel of the building a bit more. And often clients have got different ways of doing that. Some are quite happy to let us take the lead, and we can look a bit more widely at the context of the site and the client's sort of preferences generally. Or we might have clients that are quite interested in the likes of Pinterest or even just montaging in terms of cutting out of magazines and starting to develop a range of ideas. And I think that the important thing is that they don't necessarily have to have an idea or a building that they would like to achieve, but it's kind of often picking up on a range of ideas that they've got or things that they like, so that you can develop a building that's both, I guess from our practice's point of view, is both very client focused, but also very contextually focused. So making sure the building is responding as well as it can for the context of the site, how it fits in and nestles with its environment and its surroundings, but also how it sort of responds to the client's requirements, and if there's any particular desires that they like at the same point in time. So ultimately that starts to lead to a design that is very unique. It means that usually every building is very different, and is very tailored and bespoke to each client's outcomes.
And at that stage, with a concept, that can then be priced, which gives people a good understanding of, that's your start point, that's what you're looking at, and it can evolve from there depending on how they want to take it.
That's right, yeah. So the earlier we get sort of any engagement, either a builder or a quantity surveyor, and develop up that, start to consider costings is really important. We want to make sure that we're not designing a building that's not too aspirational or unaffordable for the client. And it also means that moving forward after the concept, we can actually move into the develop design phase and actually make any changes to the design and enhance the design to meet budget and keep it within the client's budget at the same time. So then we sort of lead on to the develop design process, which is essentially what I was talking about before, where we'd start to make changes to make sure we're within budget, either above or below sometimes. And at the same time, we're then looking a bit more at the buildability of the building, more specific specification of the building around materials. We'd start to consider a bit more detail around heating and cooling of the building, and also sort of any sustainable aspects of the building too, in terms of its orientation. You'd be looking at sort of the likes of louvers and things and how they might provide any shading to the building, depending on its orientation as well. We'd also be looking at the same time, it's also really good to start to incorporate any sort of landscape aspects to the building, and we'd usually sort of encourage that any landscape architects is engaged with as soon as you can within the process. Sometimes it's not as easy as that, but what we'd usually prefer is they're on board as soon as we can to start to look at how the building actually integrates with the landscape. We like to look at the overall site as a composition, so you've got the landscape and the building working together. And the two actually inform each other.
Yeah, and there's certain regions in New Zealand here. For example, is the Tasman region, where that landscape plan is very important. It's actually part of the process that you actually have to have that as part of your consent process. So it's vital.
Yeah, and I think people often, particularly in the Tasman region, are moving out to lifestyle blocks and rural properties, and that's all part of the rural character that they're trying to create. So you don't want to be having a building being designed in isolation to that landscape.
No.
It all needs to be knitted and nestled together to get a nice formal outcome. Yeah. So after the develop design process, that's again we can have another cost check at that particular point, see what changes have been made between the concept and the idea of any cost savings or any cost additions have been transferred through to that design and have been captured. And after the develop design process and the costs have been rechecked, then we'd proceed for the building consent drawings. Now the building consent drawings are at that particular point within the develop design. Most key decisions have been made, and we'd usually look at trying to get our interior specialist designer on board early, and we really look at developing the design with our interior specialist, so that the building, once we get to building consent stage, the interiors are also very well specified, and the building consent stage is really, or what we call detailed design as well, is really about the documentation of the building. And is sort of around compliance and how the building actually is put together in terms of construction, specification of materials, etc. So the idea is that there's not a lot of changes during that process, and we've done our job during the concept design and the develop design, and it's more of a documentation, formal process dealing with resource consents and building consent process, and the final specification of the building, essentially.
Okay. So at that point, once everything has gone through the council and the building consent is issued, obviously people have a couple of options as far as your services go as well.
That's right. So we can assist with both the procurement process in terms of final pricing, and as well as sort of any contract observation and administration of the construction contract as well. So there's a variety of options there. Once we've essentially provided the building consent or detailed design package, there's options in terms of how that's ultimately priced. If you've been working with a builder already, then it's a case of just getting that final negotiation. They're going out to their sub-trades and obviously looking at their carpentry and giving you a final figure, firming that figure up. Alternatively, other procurement options include tendering or sort of working on more of a charge-up sort of basis. Each has their pros and cons ultimately. I think though, if you're looking at a building that is, the more complex the building is, then I think it's more important that you've got a builder on board who can understand those decisions, and you can work those construction details, those complex construction details through early, rather than having people sort of guessing at how it's ultimately going to go together. And then from our side is obviously the sort of construction observation administration phase. So either we can sort of 2 or 3 options there as well. Either if you're negotiated with a builder and you're on good terms with them, then they can sort of take control of that process. However, we're around to provide the support that's required for the builder in terms of construction detailing, anything that needs clarification. Or alternatively, we can be involved in sort of helping manage that process through the construction observation administration phase. Using an architect's contract, we would administer and provide monthly meetings and certifying payment schedules during that process, and then providing defecting and sort of practical completion at the end of that process.
Yeah, okay. So, because one thing we do find that with the more complex the job, even if basically your side of the process is basically finished at the consent stage, we still have situations where the building evolves as we move through the project, and we still have to come back to obviously get more involvement from the architect to obviously change the plan sometimes, and that can happen several times through the process.
Yep, no building is the same with what we do. So, and we find that clients sometimes their preferences, or once they can start to see how the building is developed, they might have some additional ideas, which are often not necessary to make which is actually to make the building better. Every stage of the process for us is an opportunity to continue to make the building better. Yeah. So, and that can occur during the construction phase too. And if that's the case, then we're there to support the team to help provide the documentation and get the design and understand what the client's thinking. Yeah. around any of those opportunities that exist while on site to get those underway as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess a question I would ask you, what sort of common misconceptions that people have about coming to an architect? Do you?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few misconceptions. I think probably one of them is that the service that the architects provide is a service, and we're there for the client. And what the process we offer is a very transparent process. So I guess I think some people don't understand what our engagement is and what we actually do, and the time involved in order to provide that to them. Yeah. I think where we differ is we're not a housing company, and so our costs are not hidden amongst a range of other costs amongst the building. It's a very transparent cost, and it's very much just based on time. And the level of service and the scope of service that we provide can be tailored to suit each client. So that, depending on the client's requirements and what they want to achieve, that can be tailored to get a more economic outcome for them, should they desire and have some input of their own into the project too.
Okay.
So there's lots of options there. I think it's best to discuss those with the architect early on, and actually meet with the architect and talk it through, rather than necessarily thinking that you can't necessarily afford an architect or you don't want to work with an architect. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, for me, from personal experience of building for quite a period of time, I've found that generally architectural plans are easier to work with. There's more detail provided. There's actually more thought put into sizes of particular rooms, and sort of more of the finer detail has been thought through properly, whereas if it's supplied by a drafting service, it can be fairly straightforward. There is a lot of cut and paste where there's a lot of generic detail that sometimes doesn't quite gel or stack up or actually cross-reference with what you're looking at through the plan. And I think another really important thing that I have noticed is that architects have a flair for design that generally draftsmen don't. And if you want something different, something special, it doesn't have to be big, but even if it's a small, really unique house, then yeah, I would recommend an architect any day for exactly that reason.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things, is that often the best architecture is simple done well. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something that we sort of, as a focus for us, is it's not around creating complexity. In fact, it's almost the opposite. Yep. It's around trying to have a complex problem that's solved simply, and that's the key thing really, is that that's where some of the most significant value can be added to the project. It's by solving complex programs simply.
Can you sort of see that that's where architectural design is heading now? That people are that's becoming more common as far as simplistic houses that. As opposed to, obviously, in the past, people went to a lot of trouble to put in as much detail as possible. You think it's trending that way?
Yeah, I think there's been I think there's a bit of a reaction at the moment within architecture and I think in the building industry around complexity. I think probably through the 90s there was a significant period where there was a thought that complexity probably made a difference, and I think some of those complex architectural designs often led to problems, both in terms of cost, but I think in terms of long-term durability of buildings. So I think we, as a profession, have understood that and look to provide more elegant solutions moving forward that are actually more durable and robust for everybody's protection, really.
Okay. What sort of trends are we seeing these days or new trends?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key. There's some in terms of trends. You've got there's sort of the more of a tiny house sort of movement. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of people. The cost of building continues to rise, just through material supply and availability of resource. So we're seeing that people are now starting to think about what more for less. So what can you actually achieve in a smaller building, which you can then sort of get more quality through. So I think we're now starting to see the houses are starting to get smaller again, but actually the quality of them is increasing. So better insulation, better glazing, better heating, and creating more comfortable and ultimately more sustainable buildings. The other big movement we're seeing is around sustainability. So there has been the Zero Carbon Act come in this year, which I think is only just starting to get momentum, but will have some profound impact on the building industry, but also the wider social issues and actually how we live as a whole.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to start to see more, there's going to be more density of building moving forward, less buildings out in the country potentially, but also I think more importantly there's going to be more awareness around the materials that are being specified, the way the buildings are being built, so the lower energy use buildings will need to be zero carbon, both in terms of actual energy used moving forward, but also in terms of the embodied energy which is built within buildings. So I think you're going to see a lot more timber. New Zealand's already used a lot of timber, but I think there's going to be a renewed focus on timber, less reliance on steel and aluminium, and I think as a whole moving forward.
Yeah, so obviously now with how they're experimenting with timber products with laminations, it obviously solves a lot of those problems, that we can now use laminated timber where in the past we had to use steel as an example.
That's right, and I think what we'll see too is a renewed use of local materials. So I think the use of sort of Indonesian hardwoods and the like, I think is probably going to be in the mid-term will become redundant.
Yep.
And there's a lot more sort of engineered timbers that are being developed for both decking and cladding and structural members as well. Yeah.
Okay. I guess another area that is probably going to change a lot as well is inner city design as well. Obviously, with the availability of land, and even in subdivisions now, section sizes are shrinking. That, as you mentioned, that everything's trending to be smaller. For the survival of a lot of cities, I believe obviously there's going to have to be a lot more inner city development as well to encourage people back in living in those environments.
That's right, and I think that's where design becomes significantly more important.
Yeah.
That you're really trying to minimise your lot sizes and your building sizes, and you really have to really start dealing with privacy and sunlight and acoustics, and the buildings become a lot more technically challenging, and that's where some of the real design comes in. In terms of making sure the big trick is creating affordable, livable buildings within the city.
And I guess depending on where that city is, you've also got to deal with how they fit into the environment and what restrictions there are. And also certain buildings obviously can be repurposed, but parts of the buildings have to be obviously kept because they've got a historical value.
Yeah, so dealing with historic buildings and essentially repurposing buildings will also be quite a big change, I think, moving forward. There's a lot of commercial buildings that probably have run their course in terms of their commercial activity around retailing in particular. And again, it's a very sustainable push at the moment, is around any buildings that you can be repurposed and reused to obviously get preference. And I think that's where we can sort of rejuvenate and reinvigorate these city centres through the adaptive reuse of commercial buildings into residential spaces. Yeah,
and it changes the whole dynamic of the city, and obviously makes them more livable places, and they become more popular, and it's a sort of snowball effect.
Absolutely, and I think overall more sustainable. More people in the city, less reliance on traffic, infrastructure, and driving.
Well, I guess, at this point we can probably wrap the subject up and hopefully return to it in the future with some really good tips and new ideas.
Yes, no, it's been great to have you on, so thank you.
Thank you for your time, Simon.
Thank you.